Hey everyone, Tin Man here with a guide to one of my favorite builds right now in Dota Underlords, the 3-star everything hyper reroll build. This build is based around warriors and hunters, and mainly the tier 1 and tier 2 units. By staying at a lower level, at level 5, for a big portion of the early and mid game, rather than leveling up to 6 or even 7 like most players do, we can use that extra gold that would be spent on leveling up to instead reroll at that lower level, which has higher odds of the tier 1 and tier 2 units, to get those units up to 3-star as quickly as possible, which are very, very powerful in the mid and late game. Let's talk about some of the pros and cons of this build. It is actually quite reliable if it's uncontested. You're going to be spending a lot of rerolls, so even if you're a little bit unlucky with some of the rolls, you're going to have a lot of the rerolls, so eventually that randomness kind of balances out, and it's actually quite reliable to get many 3-star units. It's very powerful at all points in the game. It has good early game units, a strong mid game when you're rerolling a lot, and even goes well into the late game when you have like 5 or 6 3-star units. It's also very simple and easy to play. The positioning is very easy. You have 6, maybe 7 units, and they follow some pretty simple rules of how to position them. The cons, though, is it's pretty low flexibility. You're going to have a core of 5 or 6 units, and those units are not really going to change too much. So if one unit's really not showing up, you don't have too many options to really flex out of it. It's also highly dependent on getting those 3-star units, so sometimes you find yourself in a really awkward spot where you have like 8 of the 9 copies you need to get a 3-star unit, and it's just taking up a lot of bench space, it's taking up a lot of gold, and it can get a little bit awkward in that moment. It's also quite weak if it is heavily contested, especially for Beastmaster, who is the most important unit in the build by far. So if a lot of other people are going for a lot of these same units, you might want to shy away from this build. Let's talk about some of the core units here. In this top section, the always play, these are 5 units that you are almost always going to play in this build. You've got Axe, Beastmaster, Drow Ranger, Pudge, and Slarder. These 5 are really the core. Beastmaster in particular is the most important unit, but Axe will give you the early Brawny bonus with him. Pudge and Slarder round out the Warrior Alliance with Axe. Drow Ranger and Pudge give you the powerful Heartless Alliance. And then, of course, Slarder is just a great damage dealer and also gives you the option to move into scaled late game with the Tide Hunter. You're almost always going to play Wind Ranger as well, although sometimes if she doesn't show up, she is flexible because you don't use both of her alliances. We're not going to be using the elusive tag, but we will use the hunter. And while she's probably the best hunter to put in because she's the easiest to get to 3-star, if for whatever reason she doesn't show up, you can sometimes sub her out for some other options we'll discuss in a moment. As for the 7th and 8th units, generally Tide Hunter is the premier pick because it'll give you the scaled bonus while also giving you good CC effects. But Alchemist and Doom are also good options as well as just any other 4 or 5 cost unit that you find. Just anything will be good once you've completed your core and you're moving into the late game, depending on what your opponents have and what you find. There are some alternative units though. If you can't happen to find Axe, sometimes Juggernaut could work. Typically you do want Axe though because he's a lot cheaper and he's a lot easier to get to 3-star than Juggernaut, but sometimes you just find a 2-star Juggernaut before you find any Axes, and in that case he is an acceptable substitute. If you cannot find Wind Ranger, you can use one of these other hunters such as Mirana, Sniper, or Lycan. If you're using Sniper or Lycan, you probably want to get them to 3-star, although that's going to be a lot more expensive and a lot harder to find since they are tier 3 units rather than tier 2 units. If you're using Mirana, she's pretty acceptable even if you only get her to 2-star. So the game plan here is to never level up. Well, maybe not never, but you never level up until round 25 or so. Most people will start leveling up very early on in the first 9 rounds of the game. This build does not want to level. I can't stress that enough. Don't level up. This will allow you to get an early 2-star Beastmaster or other 2-star units early on, as you'll have higher odds for the tier 1 and tier 2 units. And Beastmaster is so important to the build because he deals so much of the damage, and you want to get him to 2-star as soon as possible. If you don't find him to 2-star, he can't rack up too many kills, and he's just going to be a weaker unit later in the game. So that's a high priority to really be a signal to go into this build. You also want to scout your opponents. If you see too many other people contesting for Beastmaster or some of the other core units and hunters, you might want to shy away from this build because it is much weaker if contested. It'll be harder to find those 3-star units. Early on at level 5, you're going to want to play either 3 warriors or 3 hunters for that early alliance, just whichever one you have more 2-star units of. And then at level 5, you want to be re-rolling your excess gold that's above 50. Typically you'll hit 50 gold in the range of around 13 to 15, and then you want to spend your excess gold rerolling trying to find more of those units. On round 16, which is right before you will naturally level up to level 7, you want to reroll as much of your gold as you can on that turn, probably down to 20 or 30 gold. So you're going to be rolling 10, 15, or maybe even 20 times, just trying to find some upgrades right before you lose those really premier odds for the tier 1 and tier 2 units. Then once you get to level 6, you're going to want to go for the 3 warriors and 3 hunters composition, and then hopefully complete as many 3-star units as possible. By round 25, you'll only need to spend 10 gold to level up to level 7, and by this point you hopefully have at least 3 or 4 3-star units, preferably maybe even 5 or 6 if you get all of them, if you get very lucky. And then by that point you want to add in the various late game options, such as Tidehunter, Alchemist, as discussed before. Some of the ideal items for this composition are Smuggler. That's one of the best items in the early game, not just because it gives you the extra quality of loot later on. It's actually because we run so low on numbers of units, you actually can sometimes run into a problem where you have too many items and not enough units to put them on. By round 25, you'll get your 7th item, and you're probably just going to be leveling up to 7 on that point. But if you don't want to level at that time, or maybe even if you get to level or to round 30 and you're still at level 7, you're going to have too many items to put on your units. So sometimes you want to prioritize getting a global item, and Smuggler is one of the best. Beastmaster, the most important unit in the build, has a lot of different options that you can put on him. Early game, Helm of the Undying is great so that he can stick around and maybe grab another kill or 2 with another cast of his ability. Refresher Orb is great to get 2 quick abilities of Wild Axes to deal lots of burst damage, and Octarine Essence is actually really powerful as well, reducing the cooldown on his Wild Axes, letting him cast over and over again, just like a Refresher Orb. For your other hunters, Drow Ranger and Wind Ranger, Mask of Madness and Maelstrom are 2 of the best items. They're going to be attacking very fast from the back line, so Maelstrom has lots of chances to proc, and Mask of Madness is just great since neither of their abilities are too impactful, or rather, only Wind Ranger's ability is silenced by the Mask of Madness, and Drow Ranger, there's no downside to putting it on her. But Mask of Madness is really good on either Drow or Wind Ranger. And finally, Blade Mail is actually a ridiculously powerful item in this build because you're playing Brawnies and you're playing Pudge, both of which who have very large health totals. Blade Mail will reflect a lot of the damage back. I've even seen when you get a 3-star Pudge, you put a Blade Mail on him, and he's actually the top damage dealer on your team for a few rounds, until at least you get like a 3-star Beastmaster or something. But don't underestimate the damage potential of Blade Mail, especially on Pudge or 3-star Axe. Let's talk about positioning here. As I said before, positioning is relatively simple and straightforward. In the early game, you're going to want to have your tankiest units kind of closer to the center and kind of in front of your weaker damage dealing units. Beastmaster is always behind the front line, so that hopefully all of your opponents will attack your Axe and your Pudge first, whose main job is there to just tank damage and prevent your higher damage dealers from taking any aggro. Whenever you get multiple hunters, you're going to want to stack them up adjacent to each other. Here we've got Drow Ranger and Wind Ranger adjacent so that we can maximize the value of Drow Ranger's aura. Once again, we place all of them behind our tanky frontliners and Axe and Pudge. Whenever you get up to 6 units, you can generally place your weaker hunter in the corner, whether that be Wind Ranger or Drow Ranger, depending on your star levels and items, because that way, if your opponent is running Pudge themselves, their hook is going to target the furthest hunter away. So you want to put your weakest one in the corner, and put your strongest one offset one to the side here. See how we have the 3-star Wind Ranger to the right of the 2-star Drow Ranger. You can also set Slarder back behind the tanks because he's a damage dealer just like Beastmaster. He's not as good a damage dealer as Beastmaster, but he's not nearly as tanky as Axe or Pudge. So you want to make sure he's set back and doesn't draw initial attacks from the opponent. Also in this positioning, he can help to pick up opposing assassins before they get onto your squishier hunters like Drow Ranger and Wind Ranger. But that's really it. It's really an amazing build. It's very simple, it's elegant in its simplicity. It's very strong if it is uncontested on Beastmaster. It is not very flexible though, because there really was not too many options, and if you find out later that you're not finding these things to 3-star, there's not a lot of options to pivot to another build, especially because most other builds do want you to level up early and spend that gold on leveling rather than re-rolling. That being said, it is great when it does work, and it actually works a lot. So I hope you liked this, so make sure you like and subscribe. Follow me on Twitch over at twitch.tv/tinman354, and also a big thanks to all of my Patreon supporters, patreon.com/tinman354. If you like this and want to see more, please consider supporting me there. Hope you enjoyed it, and I'll see you next time.